Final fight for the ZX Spectrum. Yes, we're heading back to Metro City to deep dive into the ZX Spectrum version of Final Fight. Having had a blast with all the weird Street Fighter games that I covered here on the channel last year, I was keen to see how well the good people at US Gold would have ported perhaps the most famous of the classic beat-em-up games. So without further delay, let's smash an oil drum, pick up a metal pipe, and play Final Fight for the ZX Spectrum. Yes, this is Final Fight for the ZX Spectrum, and what a sight it is to behold. For anyone who saw my coverage of the ZX Spectrum version of Street Fighter 2, this will feel very familiar. The likelihood is that you'll notice two things about this game straight away. Firstly, that the game has managed to retain the look of the original arcade game fairly closely, in that the locations, playable characters, and villains all have the same artwork and design as they do in the arcade original. But that brings me to the second thing that you have probably already noticed. Yeah, it's all done effectively in black and white. And when I say effectively, that is because it's usually black and one other colour, like yellow and black, black and blue, or even sometimes black and white. The first couple of screens where it tells you the story of the game do give you a false sense of security with about 3 or 4 colours present, but after that it is just black and insert colour name here for the remainder of the entire game. But heck, before all the haters start drinking down the haterade and hating on the game, let me remind you that the original Game Boy was essentially a black and white console. So let's not judge too harshly on the lack of colour and get into all of the reasons why and what it does have to offer before we judge it too harshly. Well, actually, I've wanted to cover this game on the channel for many months. But well, yeah, it has been a minute, hasn't it? Now, for anyone who has followed my channel over the last year or so, will know that I have been on something of a quest to uncover and unearth all the old, forgotten and downright weird Street Fighter games from across the history of the franchise. And that, of course, has included covering the Final Fight games, as they are set in the same universe and are therefore Street Fighter adjacent. Now, one of my favourite weird Street Fighter games to cover was the ZX Spectrum version of the Street Fighter 2 port. That was both a masterpiece of an achievement and a disaster piece, as the sacrifices they have to make this run on the humble ZX Spectrum were a sight to behold. Now, having played that, I was keen to play the Spec's Final Fight port, which, like Street Fighter 2, was handled by US Gold. Now, to think in my youth, I'd look at the logo for US Gold on the game boxes and thought that was a sign of high quality games. It wasn't. Instead, it was a sign of a high quality game being badly ported to a home computer that usually wasn't capable of running the game in question. Now, as any fans of the ZX Spectrum scene may already know, it doesn't seem to be the easiest task in the world to get a copy of the original ZX Spectrum Final Fight game to work in this day and age. Now, it might be if you have an original tape and an original ZX Spectrum and they both still work, but unfortunately I do not. See, I had to go a more modern route, and every method I tried was giving me trouble. After just about battling to get Street Fighter 2 to work, I set out to play Final Fight and tried every emulator I could find on PC, on Android, and even my trusty old ZX Spectrum Vega to get it to work. And no dice. So, what changed? Yes, you've probably guessed it, Retro Games Limited have just released the Spectrum, which is a fantastic little plug-and-play console/personal computer hybrid thingy, and it follows on from their excellent the C64 Mini, and then the C64 Maxi, the VIC-20, the A500 Mini, and the 400 Mini, as another great mini recreation of a home computer from yesteryear, which features both a bunch of built-in games and the ability to add your own. So, keen to finally play Final Fight, I found that none of my copies worked on it. Can't get past the character select screen on any different emulator. Oh well, it would be game over, except like a Christmas miracle, I found a hacked copy of the game, or should that be cracked or modded version of the game, that I could get to run, not on the Spectrum Mini, but on the PC, using an SCL file extension, where the Spectrum, the Mini one, likes to use tap files. Just for clarity here, the Mini one, which isn't actually mini, it's like a full-size computer of a Spectrum, but the original was a mini home computer, or a micro, I guess, anyway. That is just called the Spectrum. And the Spectrum likes to have .tap files. What I managed to get to work is a .scl file. So for anyone who doesn't understand that, that will be jargon, but for anyone that does, that should be the copy you're looking for if you wish to play it. But the great news is I did in fact get to play the game and get it working. And now I have the Spectrum. Hopefully one day they'll do an update which will allow that file format to work. Now, enough of all that jargon, because as you can probably tell, it's getting confusing. Examining the game itself, the game does feature all 6 stages from the arcade game, and just like the arcade original, they all feature the same boss fights at the end of the stage, as you would expect. It's actually remarkable what they have achieved here in terms of bringing something that is recognisable as the arcade game onto the ZX Spectrum. The character sprites are huge, just as the ones in Street Fighter 2 were on the ZX Spectrum. You can still play as Hagger, Guile and Cody, and for this run through I chose to stick with my guy. No, not Guy, but my guy of choice, Mike Hagger. The game is about his daughter being kidnapped after all. I mean, sure, Cody is her fella, but blood is blood, and when her dad is former champion Street Fighter and Metro City Mayor Mike Hagger, he has the highest stakes in this thing. Now, despite the huge characters, there are limitations on what they can do outside of the whole colour thing. You only ever seem to face 2 enemies at a time, which truthfully makes the game a little bit easy. And yes, the sharp-eyed amongst you will notice that I'm playing a modded version with infinite lives on. Look, the game may be fairly easy, but it's also something of a chore to get through, just visually. So I wanted to get the footage from this in a one-and-done fashion. The biggest limitation has to be the frame rate, which is heavily reduced to near comical levels. Unless Hagger was doing a dropkick, which itself seems to be 2 frames, his actual jump appears mostly like levitation. The game has next to no sound in it, no music after the intro screen, and just sounds of punches connecting throughout. If you manage to pick up a weapon like a steel pipe, that does make a swish sound, and I think one of the bosses had some other noises, but that's about it. I think most kids playing this who grew up with the ZX Spectrum in a contemporary setting will have just accepted that games were limited compared to the arcades, but almost employed a kind of like beer goggles to accept the downgrades. It was a simpler time, but we were happy. You shouldn't have been too happy if you were a kid and your only choice was to play the ZX Spectrum version if your friends had Final Fight on their Amigas or Super Nintendo. I mean, you may have had beer goggles, but surely you weren't that blind to reality. The scrolling in the game is a little bit choppy to say the least, but I was impressed with the section of the game on the lift/raising platform area, which did have a nice scrolling background effect. I kind of didn't expect them to include it, if I'm honest. The game also does have some weird collision detection, and I found that I was button mashing a lot of the time to pull off tornado punches and pile drivers. On the ZX Spectrum, it was all pretty much the same tactic of keeping to the bottom of the screen and luring enemies in to fight one at a time. Strangely, I sometimes found that I could walk all the way to the end of a level and then have to either wait for baddies to catch up with me to fight, or that I'd have to travel back to seek them out to beat up. It unfortunately isn't that you can leave an area before you've cleared all the enemies. The ending of the game is incredibly short, with little more than a "well done, game over." My understanding is that you can play this as a 2-player game, but I didn't do that for this deep dive, and I've also played it with a keyboard, although I think it'd be a great game to play with a joystick. For this game is a product of its time, and like my view on the ZX Spectrum of Street Fighter 2, it's clear to me why this game was made as it was. For US Gold, trying to sell this next to other versions of Final Fight on shop shelves, what they had to do was convince people that it was as good as any of the others. And how were they going to do it? Was it the demo? Was it the YouTube videos? Nope, because you couldn't really do this back then. Well, there was no YouTube at all, and demos, I guess, in theory were possible, but that wasn't going to be what they did. Instead, you would have pictures in magazines, and screenshots on the back of the box. And like with Street Fighter 2, the still images of this version look incredible. Gigantic sprites and all the same designs as in the arcade. Most games couldn't do that even on more powerful platforms. People knew that the ZX Spectrum was limited in terms of colour, but probably figured it was a worthwhile sacrifice. The trick US Gold had up their sleeve was that the game looked great in screenshots, even if it didn't look great in motion. But by that time, you've already bought the game. The reviews at the time are mostly positive, although it is worth noting that back in the days of the late 80s and early 90s, reviews in game magazines can sometimes not be taken too seriously, as there may have been an agenda at play. With more powerful gaming consoles and home computers about, each of the magazines that focused on specific platforms were more likely to big up the versions that played on their platform. After all, if the reviewers at Crash or your Sinclair were to say that, well, Final Fight on the ZX Spectrum is a nice try, but get it on the Amiga if you can, they wouldn't really be securing their job futures, would they? They'd be helping bring around the end of the ZX Spectrum as people left the platform behind, and soon they wouldn't have a platform to write about. In a modern context, there is really no reason to play this version of Final Fight, unless of course you're like me and are interested in the history and evolution of video games, or that you have a strange fixation on playing bad and weird versions of games. I know that I do. But don't get me wrong, if you do have a little free time and you have a copy of this, there is a little bit of fun to be had. But, elephant in the room, if you want the real deal and the best Final Fight experience you can get on the ZX Spectrum, you should check out Mighty Final Fight on the system. It's a homebrew port of the NES game, and it shows all of what this game could and should have been. Now, I'm sure at the time having the reduced graphics could have been held against it, especially in the UK where ZX Spectrum was king, and where attitudes were often all about graphics equals good. But Mighty Final Fight, which was a NES game, released a few years after the original, plays so much smoother than the official Final Fight port, and looks better in my opinion too. The chibi graphics are an intentional choice, whereas the lack of colour and choppy frame rate is a limitation on this version. I do wonder if they could have had the characters as a different colour to the background, or your character is one colour and the enemies are another colour. That would have helped make things a little bit clearer. So, there you have it. Final Fight for the ZX Spectrum was a bit of a challenge for me to get a copy and device to play on, but we got there in the end. And I guess before we wrap things up today, I'll take this opportunity for a little channel update as well. I know a few of you have asked Why things have gone a little bit quiet on the channel in the second half of the year? Well, don't worry, all is okay. I just found that life and other projects were getting in the way. But I kept the channel going with regular shorts and occasionally went live to play a game and do a little bit of a chat. In 2025, I expect Geek Battle Gaming will have loads more documentaries, console deep dives, and classic and modern gaming reviews. And I expect there to be tons more shorts and some live sessions as well. Keep the comments coming in and let me know what you'd like to see me tackle on the channel, as feedback is always useful. And as always, until next time, make sure you smash that subscribe button here on the Geek Battle Gaming YouTube channel. If you want the written article version of this, head over to www.xstreamed.tv/gaming. And until next time, stay safe, always stay extremed, and ciao for now. Boom, and we're out of here.